The gates creaked open beneath the burning Pacific sun, and a column of weary Japanese soldiers stumbled forward. Men who once carried the rising sun banner into battle, now reduced to silent silhouettes moving under guard. Their boots dragged through dust and gravel, their faces gaunt from hunger and defeat. For years these men had fought across jungles and islands, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, sustained only by the Emperor's orders and the illusion of honor through death. But that illusion had shattered. The war was over, and for the first time they were prisoners. The air at the American camp was thick with the smell of oil, soap and sweat, an alien scent to men accustomed to the rot of the tropics. As they passed through the barbed wire, every eye was sharp with suspicion. The American guards, tall and broad-shouldered, said little. Their rifles glinted under the sun, and their expressions betrayed neither hatred nor pity, only discipline. The prisoners were searched, catalogued and tagged like cargo. Each man's name was written down in English letters he could not read. Some stood straight, refusing to bow their heads even in defeat. Others trembled, glancing toward the horizon where they once imagined the Japanese fleet would come to rescue them. But the sea was quiet now. The empire was gone. All that remained was the uncertainty of captivity. To the Japanese mind, surrender was shame, a fate worse than death. Yet here they stood breathing, their pride wounded, but their instinct for life stronger than their code. They had been told that Americans were cruel, that captured soldiers would be tortured, starved, perhaps executed. Rumors from distant fronts had painted a picture of barbarism, stories spread by dying officers, desperate to keep men fighting. So as the gates closed behind them, the prisoners braced for humiliation, for the enemy's revenge. Instead, they were met with procedure. Orders were barked in English, translated roughly by interpreters. Line up, move forward, keep quiet. It was mechanical, efficient, not cruel, not kind. Yet to men who had lived in chaos, even order could feel menacing. Ahead stood rows of wooden huts, barbed wire fences stretching endlessly across the horizon. American engineers had built these camps with the same precision. They built airfields and runways, clean, organized, designed to contain and sustain. But to the defeated soldiers, it looked like an industrial prison, a place where the machinery of the enemy extended even into the business of captivity. Some prisoners whispered prayers under their breath. Others muttered defiance, promising to die before being shamed further. But death did not come. Instead came the most unexpected of commands. Medical check, showers. The words were foreign, their meaning uncertain. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Showers, it was impossible to believe. To them, it sounded like a euphemism, a polite American word for something darker. In the distance, a large building loomed, wooden walls, steam rising from vents, metal pipes protruding like arms of some mechanical beast. It did not look like mercy. It looked like the unknown. One young soldier, barely 20, remembered stories of German camps whispered through the ranks, of gas, of death behind closed doors. His hands shook as he walked, but he hid it from the guards. He would not show fear. Yet deep down, every man in that line felt the same dread, that their final chapter was about to be written, not by the Emperor, but by the enemy's machinery. The camp was silent, except for the rhythm of boots on the ground and the faraway hiss of steam. The sun beat down, merciless as always, as the men moved deeper into captivity, through the gates of surrender, towards something they could not yet understand. The prisoners shuffled forward in uneasy silence, the sound of boots scuffing dirt breaking the heavy air. Ahead, the long wooden building hissed like a sleeping animal, steam spilling from vents, pipes trembling under pressure. The word showers echoed again through the translator, but few believed it. For men who had been taught to fear Western cruelty, the thought of being cleansed by their conquerors carried a chilling undertone. Each step toward the structure felt like a march into the unknown. Some soldiers whispered hurried prayers, others tightened their fists, preparing to resist whatever awaited inside. The American guards gave no hints, their expressions unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses and discipline. Inside, the air was warm and sharp with disinfectant, a sterile scent that burned the nose. Metal pipes lined the ceiling, each fitted with nozzles. Wooden benches stood along the walls, and neatly folded piles of clothing lay on tables nearby. It was too orderly, too clean, and that frightened them even more. One guard gestured brusquely, motioning for the first group to strip. The interpreter repeated the order in Japanese, his voice trembling slightly. "Remove clothing. All of it." A murmur of panic rippled through the line. These were soldiers of the Emperor, men taught from birth to guard their dignity with their lives. To undress before the enemy was unthinkable. Yet the rifles trained on them spoke louder than pride. Slowly, hesitantly they obeyed. Uniforms that had once borne Japan's insignia fell to the floor, sweat-soaked, torn, crawling with lice. The stench of years in the field filled the room, thick and sour. Naked and ashamed, the men stood shivering not from cold but humiliation. Then came the spray, a sudden rush of hot water hammering against their skin. The shock of it drew gasps and curses, but there was no pain, no poison, only warmth. Steam filled the air, curling around gaunt bodies as dirt and filth streamed down the drains. For the first time in years, many of them felt clean, truly clean. A silence fell, broken only by the sound of water. The fear began to fade, replaced by confusion, then disbelief. The guards were not torturing them. They were washing them. Afterward, they were handed towels, razors, and soap. Simple things that now seemed impossible luxuries. A medic approached with a clipboard, examining skin, checking for infections, treating wounds. The prisoners watched astonished as the Americans disinfected their cuts, offered water, and even smiled faintly. For men raised to expect cruelty, this kindness was more unsettling than punishment. One officer, a veteran of Bataan, stared at the medic who cleaned his hand and whispered to no one, "Why?" The answer never came, but the gesture spoke louder than words. The same enemy they had sworn to die fighting was now ensuring they lived. Outside, fresh uniforms awaited, plain khaki without insignia but clean and warm. As they dressed, a strange stillness settled over the men. The fear had not vanished, but something had shifted, an unspoken understanding that their captors did not intend to kill them. In its place was confusion, even shame, for they had imagined the Americans as monsters. Instead, they were organized, efficient, almost indifferent, warriors of a different kind. That night, as the sun set over the camp's barbed horizon, the Japanese prisoners lay on cots softer than the ground they had slept on for years. The memory of hot water lingered on their skin, the scent of soap foreign but comforting. For the first time since surrender, they closed their eyes without expecting death. The war, at least for them, was truly over, though none yet understood how captivity could become its own kind of battlefield, where dignity, belief, and humanity would be tested all over again. Morning came quietly, the Pacific sun bleeding gold across rows of barbed wire and watchtowers. The camp stirred to life in the rhythm of a new routine. Bugles, boots, and the metallic clang of mess tins. The Japanese prisoners awoke stiff and uncertain, their minds caught between soldierly instinct and the alien calm of captivity. No bombs, no orders shouted in desperation, no jungle stench of rot or gunpowder, only the mechanical order of an American prison camp. To men forged in the chaos of war, this precision felt unreal. They lined up automatically, their discipline still intact, though their purpose had dissolved with the Empire's surrender. Officers who once commanded hundreds now stood barefoot in the same dust as their privates. The chain of command persisted in whispers and glances, but the Americans ignored it. Here rank meant nothing. The Emperor's authority had no reach beyond the wire. Breakfast came, steaming metal trays of food heavier than any rations they had seen in years. Bread, eggs, meat. The sight alone was unsettling. To men who had survived on rice balls and dried fish, it felt excessive, even shameful, to eat the enemy's food. Yet hunger had no pride. They ate in silence, eyes down, each bite a quiet rebellion against the code of honor that had brought them to ruin. Nearby, an American sergeant watched with folded arms, amused by how neatly the Japanese lined up without command. "Most disciplined prisoners I ever saw," he muttered to another guard. But what he could not see was the invisible current of shame running through that discipline, the inner storm of men who had lived by Bushido and were now powerless to die by it. After breakfast came work. Orders were given, tools handed out, shovels, hammers, saws. The Americans made them repair fences, clear debris, haul supplies. It was not punishment, but occupation, a way to keep idle minds from decay. The Japanese complied without complaint, their motions efficient, precise. Years of military habit made obedience instinctive. But beneath that quiet surface, Each man wrestled with ghosts. Some officers still whispered of escape, of seppuku, of redeeming honor in blood. But those were only words now, hollow echoes of a dead cause. Others began to observe. The Americans, their manner, their machines. They saw the guards joke freely, saw black and white soldiers share rations, saw order maintained without fear. It defied everything they had been taught about Western weakness. The enemy, they realized, was not decadent at all. He was disciplined, just differently. As days passed, the Americans' efficiency became something to study. The camp ran like a factory, clean barracks, rotating shifts, food distributed on time. Even in victory, the enemy was precise. The Japanese began to adapt. They swept their huts, folded their bedding with geometric perfection, and bowed slightly when guards passed, not out of subservience but habit. The Americans noticed, and in time, mutual curiosity replaced silent hostility. A few guards even attempted Japanese words, awkwardly offering cigarettes or extra rations. For the first time, laughter, brief, uncertain, crossed the wire of pride. Yet the war still lived in memory. At night, when the lights dimmed, whispers returned. Of Tokyo's ruins, of Hiroshima's silence, of families left behind. No one spoke of defeat openly, but it hung in the air heavier than the heat. They had survived battlefields, starvation, and surrender, but the hardest trial was beginning now. To exist without purpose, to live under the flag they once vowed to destroy. In the stillness of that first week, as the American flag rippled over the camp, many realized that the war had not simply ended, it had changed shape. The battlefield was no longer land or sea, but the mind itself. Days turned into weeks, and the camp settled into a rhythm as steady as the ocean tides. The Japanese prisoners, once bound by the iron code of Bushido, now found themselves caught between the fading echoes of their old world and the strange logic of their captors. Every morning began with inspection, followed by work details that took them through the neat geometry of the camp, rows of huts, watchtowers, and fences that gleamed in the sunlight. The Americans maintained everything with an order almost military in its precision, yet there was an ease to it, a confidence without cruelty. To men who had known officers that ruled with fists and fury, this quiet discipline was both alien and disarming. The guards barked commands, but not with hatred. They enforced rules, but allowed laughter. It was a structure built not on fear, but on system, and that realization began to unsettle the prisoners more deeply than any weapon could. They had been told that Americans were lazy, soft, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here they saw young men from distant farms and cities, standing tall, running efficient routines, treating even their enemies with a measured kind of respect. It contradicted everything the Japanese command had drilled into their bones. Some prisoners whispered that it was a trick, propaganda meant to weaken their spirit. Others began to question quietly in their hearts whether everything they had been taught about the decadent West had been wrong. Each day chipped away at certainty, like waves eroding stone. The food was still strange, bread that crumbled like dust, meat that smelled too rich, coffee that burned bitter on the tongue, but hunger made it familiar. The showers, once feared as instruments of death, had become routine, a small comfort in a world stripped of meaning. Even sickness was treated with clinical efficiency. American medics tended to fevered prisoners, changed bandages, handed out pills that eased pain faster than any Japanese remedy. Some prisoners tried to refuse at first, but the medicine worked, and soon even the proudest officers accepted it in silence. At night, the camp was still. The wind carried faint music from the American quarters, jazz, something rhythmic and strange, filled with life. It drifted across the wire and into the barracks, where the Japanese lay awake, listening to the sound of a world that had moved on without them. For many it was unbearable, the knowledge that their empire had crumbled while the enemy's spirit still danced. Yet beneath that bitterness stirred something unexpected, curiosity. Among them were engineers, mechanics, and students who had once believed Japan's destiny was to surpass the West. Now, as they watched the Americans repair engines, operate generators, or distribute rations with machine-like coordination, they recognized a different kind of strength, one rooted in technology, in process, in unity rather than hierarchy. These observations became quiet lessons. Men who had once memorized the Imperial rescript to soldiers began to memorize the patterns of American order. Still, not all accepted this new reality. Some clung to pride like a weapon. One old sergeant, who had survived Guadalcanal, spat on his rations each morning before eating, muttering that the food of the enemy carried the poison of submission. But even he could not deny the power of comfort. How the body fed and rested betrayed the mind's stubbornness. The human instinct to survive was stronger than ideology, and that truth frightened them. As the sun fell each evening, painting the sky in blood-red hues, they stood in silent lines for roll call. The flag above the camp fluttered lazily, not the red circle of the rising sun, but the stars and stripes of their conquerors. Each wave of that flag reminded them that the war was no longer about guns or glory. It was now a quiet, invisible struggle for belief itself, one that many were beginning to lose. The transformation began not with speeches or surrender, but with silence, the kind that follows exhaustion. Weeks of routine had worn down the sharp edges of hatred, leaving behind something quieter, something human. The Japanese prisoners, once rigid in posture and guarded in gaze, began to glance toward their captors with reluctant curiosity. And the Americans, who had entered this duty expecting hostility, began to see more than an enemy in the men behind the wire. They saw faces, thin, weary, disciplined, but undeniably human. War had taught them to dehumanize the other side, but captivity was an education of its own. The first bridge was built through necessity. A generator failed near the kitchen barracks, threatening to spoil the food supply. Among the prisoners was a former ship engineer named Nakamura, whose hands still carried the muscle memory of machinery. When an interpreter relayed this, the American officer hesitated, then handed Nakamura a toolbox. Under watchful eyes, the Japanese prisoner worked methodically, tracing wires and tightening bolts. Within the hour, the engine sputtered back to life, roaring as if defying the silence of defeat. The Americans clapped, a few whistled. Nakamura bowed slightly, not out of submission but instinct. For the first time, both sides smiled. It was a brief exchange, but it carried more weight than any treaty. After that, cooperation grew like grass through cracks in pavement. The Americans began assigning skilled prisoners to repair vehicles, build storage sheds, and assist in logistics. The Japanese, finding purpose again, performed with the precision that once fueled their war machine. The guards noticed that the more responsibility they gave, the less tension hung in the air. Mutual efficiency replaced suspicion. It was not friendship, not yet, but the faint outline of respect. In the evenings, small moments of humanity flickered between the lines. A young American private named Miller, barely 21, began sharing cigarettes with the prisoners during his night patrols. He had fought at Okinawa and had lost friends to men like these, yet here the rage felt distant, almost irrelevant. He spoke slowly, using gestures more than words, pointing at the moon or the stars, laughing when they nodded in understanding. One night he showed them a photograph of his family, a mother, a girl, a dog, and for a heartbeat the war vanished. The prisoners responded in kind, showing him folded pictures, some worn to translucent edges. Wives, children, faces that existed now only in memory. The wire between them was still there, but for a moment it meant nothing. For the Americans, this quiet coexistence was easier. They were victors. They could afford to be generous. For the Japanese, every act of kindness was a deeper humiliation, a reminder that they were alive because of the mercy of those they once sought to destroy. Yet within that shame something else began to bloom: understanding. They began to see the enemy not as demons, but as men of duty not unlike themselves. It was a truth they had been forbidden to believe, but captivity had stripped away ideology, leaving only the raw fact of humanity. By late autumn, the camp had changed. The Americans no longer watched every move with suspicion, and the Japanese began greeting guards with quiet nods instead of silence. A strange peace had taken root, fragile but real. It did not erase the memories of blood and fire, but it softened them. Behind the fences, amid the rhythm of labor and the smell of diesel and soap, former enemies were learning to coexist. The war that had consumed nations was slowly shrinking, now reduced to a few acres of shared ground where hate and respect wrestled quietly in the dust. By winter, the rhythm of camp life had taken on a strange familiarity. The once resentful silence that hung between prisoner and guard now carried something softer, the echo of understanding. The Americans still held their rifles. The Japanese still marched where they were told, but beneath that structure, invisible threads of connection had begun to weave through the wire. The war was still real in their memories, the firebombs over Tokyo, the screams on Saipan, the black waves of Okinawa, yet in this small corner of captivity, something was shifting. For the first time since the Empire's collapse, the prisoners began to feel like men again, not ghosts of a lost cause. The change showed itself in the smallest ways. When a storm swept through the camp, tearing down tents and flooding trenches, the Japanese prisoners moved instinctively to repair what was broken, hauling wood, clearing debris, reinforcing fences, even without orders. The Americans, watching from their posts, found themselves joining in. For hours, both sides worked side by side in the pouring rain, wordless but united by necessity. When the wind finally died, the camp stood intact, and for a brief quiet moment, laughter rippled through the mud, a sound no one had expected to hear between enemies. Later, the Americans rewarded the effort with an unusual gesture, a hot meal served without ration limits. The prisoners sat in long rows, steam rising from bowls of soup, bread and meat. Across the wire, guards did the same. It was not a truce. The war had already ended, but it felt like one. The barriers of language and ideology were giving way to something older and simpler: survival, shared labor, and respect for endurance. Among the prisoners, a few men began to emerge as voices of reason. Nakamura, the engineer, often mediated between guards and prisoners, explaining procedures and calming tempers. Another, Corporal Tanaka, a former schoolteacher from Nagasaki, started teaching English phrases to his fellow captives, copying words from scrap paper and discarded ration labels. Thank you, work, water, friend. The guards laughed at first, but began using the words back awkwardly, genuinely. These small exchanges carried enormous weight, each one a step away from the abyss of hate that had defined the years before. But not everyone welcomed this change. Some older soldiers, especially those of higher rank, saw this softening as betrayal. They still clung to the notion that the Americans' kindness was a trick, a way to dismantle their honor from within. To them, dignity could not coexist with defeat. They sat apart during meals, refused to speak to guards, and stared east each sunset, as if the horizon itself still belonged to Japan. Yet even their resistance was fading beneath the steady grind of routine and the quiet persistence of decency. It was hard to hate a man who handed you medicine when you coughed, or who gave you extra rations when the nights turned cold. One evening, just before lights out, music drifted again across the compound. A low, haunting tune played on a harmonica. The sound stopped the camp in its tracks. The melody was unfamiliar, mournful yet full of life. The Americans knew it as Home on the Range. The prisoners, though they didn't know the words, recognized the feeling. Longing, memory, loss. For a long time, no one moved. Then, from one of the huts, a prisoner began humming softly, echoing the tune. Slowly, others joined. Two worlds divided by war shared a single song under the same pale moon. That night, many lay awake, listening to the last notes fade into silence. The war that had defined their existence felt farther away than ever. The barbed wire was still there. The guards still walked their rounds. But for the first time, the prisoners no longer saw monsters beyond the fences. They saw men, tired and human, just like themselves. As the days turned colder and the camp settled into the dull rhythm of captivity, a different kind of silence began to descend. Not the tense quiet of fear, but the heavy, introspective hush of men remembering. With the fighting long over and no new orders to obey, the Japanese prisoners were left alone with their thoughts. Thoughts that the noise of battle had once drowned out. Each night, as the generators powered down and the camp dimmed under the pale wash of moonlight, memories came flooding back like ghosts slipping through the wire. Many prisoners began to dream again, though dreams were rarely kind. Some woke in the middle of the night, eyes wide, clutching their blankets, haunted by the faces of comrades left behind on forgotten islands. Others muttered names in their sleep, the syllables of wives and children who might never know they were still alive. In the waking hours, these memories hung over the camp like mist, unspoken but everywhere. Conversations that once circled around food or routine now turned to the past. The men spoke quietly, as if fearing to disturb the dead, Tanaka, the former schoolteacher, often gathered a few younger prisoners in the evenings. He would talk about his classroom in Nagasaki, about the laughter of students reciting poems before the war tore their world apart. His words carried both comfort and pain, for most of the men had been young enough to remember the lives they had left behind. The scent of tatami mats, the cries of street vendors, the rhythmic hammering of trains bound for Tokyo. Now, all of that felt impossibly distant. America had stripped them not only of their weapons, but of time itself, leaving them suspended between what had been and what would never return. Even the showers we once feared, then accepted, became strange monuments to these reflections. As hot water cascaded down their backs, the prisoners could not help but feel the contradiction of it all. Here they were, captives of the very nation that had crushed their homeland, yet treated with more care than they had received from their own commanders. It was an irony that stung deeply. Each man carried guilt for surviving, for surrendering, for washing their bodies clean while comrades' bones still lay unburied in jungles and seas. Some spoke of it quietly after bathing, voices low and trembling, saying that the warmth of the water felt undeserved. Others said nothing at all, scrubbing harder, as if to erase the shame that refused to fade. One night, Nakamura, the engineer who had once built bridges for the Imperial army, sat beneath the guard tower, staring at the searchlight sweeping across the sky. When a young American guard approached and offered him a cigarette, he hesitated before accepting. They smoked in silence for a while, the smoke curling upward into the cold air. Then, in halting English, Nakamura said, We thought you were monsters." The guard, barely older than 20, blinked, unsure how to respond. "Monsters?" he repeated softly. Nakamura nodded. "Yes, monsters, but you—" "Give us water, food, soap, I don't understand." The guard took a long drag, then simply said, "War makes monsters of everyone. I guess." The words hung there between them, a truth so simple it cut deeper than any blade. That exchange spread quietly among the prisoners. For days afterward, men repeated it in whispers, turning it over in their minds. Some found comfort in it, others only more confusion. But all agreed it marked something important, a crack in the wall that had divided conqueror and conquered. The realization that their enemy had suffered too, that both sides had been swallowed by forces larger than themselves, shook the very foundations of everything they had been taught to believe. By the time the first snow fell on the camp, the war felt like a story from another lifetime. The prisoners still wore their uniforms, still answered roll call, but their thoughts no longer belonged to the battlefield. They had begun the slow, painful work of reconciling what they had seen and what they had learned about the men they once swore to die fighting. And though they would never call it peace, something like understanding had begun to grow in its place, fragile, human, and unforgettable. For generations, the Bushido Code had defined what it meant to be Japanese: loyalty, sacrifice, death before dishonor. But inside the American POW camp, that ancient creed began to fracture. The men who had once shouted battle cries now whispered questions they dared not speak aloud during the war. What did honor mean when your sword was taken, your emperor far away, and your belly filled by the enemy's bread? In the flickering light of the barracks, Bushido no longer sounded like divine law. It sounded like a memory from another world. Many prisoners tried to hold on to it. They cleaned their boots, stood tall during roll call, and avoided looking weak in front of the guards. But cracks appeared. Some began to laugh again. Others traded small favors with Americans, learning English words for food, tools, or greetings. Each act of adaptation felt like betrayal, yet survival demanded it. The war had taught them that obedience was strength. Captivity was teaching them that humility was. Among them, Sergeant Ito still clung to the old code. He had led his men in the jungles of New Guinea, where surrender was never an option. Now he stood watch over the camp's moral order like a ghost of the past. When younger prisoners began helping Americans repair fences or carry supplies, he glared at them in silence. To him, every act of cooperation was a stain on the Imperial flag. But even Ito could not stop the slow erosion of belief. He saw how the Americans treated them, not as beasts but as men. They provided books, allowed letters, even gave them paper to draw. At first it infuriated him. Later it confused him. How could the enemy show compassion when he himself had been taught to give none? One evening, As the sun sank behind the hills and painted the camp in gold, Ito overheard laughter, genuine laughter, coming from a group of prisoners gathered near the workshop. They were sharing stories with an American mechanic about home, trading tales of their mother's cooking and childhood games. For a moment, Ito wanted to shout, to remind them of the sacred duty of the soldier. But as he approached, he saw their faces. They were not mocking Japan. They were remembering it. Something inside him shifted. Not much, but enough to make him pause. The code of Bushido had demanded sacrifice for honor, but it had never prepared him for mercy. Weeks passed, and with them came an unspoken transformation. The men who once viewed surrender as a curse began to see life as something sacred. The smallest gestures, a guard returning a lost photograph, an American medic treating a fever, carried profound meaning. The war had taken everything, but here, in this strange place, they were learning that honor did not die with defeat. It evolved through understanding. For some, this realization brought peace. For others, unbearable shame. A few refused to speak at all, spending hours staring at the sky through the barbed wire, murmuring prayers to ancestors who would never understand. Yet even they could not ignore the truth pressing down like the winter cold. The war was over, and the enemy had shown them what compassion looked like. In the barracks, Ito finally gathered his men one night and spoke quietly. "We were told to die for honor," he said, his voice trembling. "But maybe living with humility is harder, and perhaps more honorable." The men listened, eyes down, as if hearing a forbidden scripture. Outside, snow began to fall again in soft, endless, pure. For the first time since the Empire's defeat, some of them closed their eyes not in despair, but in quiet acceptance. The code was broken, yes, but from its ruins something profoundly human was beginning to rise. When the war finally ended, and the gates of the camp creaked open, the men stepped into sunlight that felt strangely unfamiliar. The guards who had once towered over them now stood with relaxed shoulders, some even offering brief nods of respect as if saying farewell to comrades rather than prisoners. The war was over, but what awaited beyond the barbed wire was not the world they had left behind. It was something entirely transformed. Trucks arrived to take them to the docks, where ships waited to carry them back across the Pacific, back to a homeland they no longer recognized. As they rode in silence, faces pressed against the dusty windows, they saw towns untouched by bombs, children playing in the fields, and the ordinary rhythm of American life moving forward, oblivious to the ruins on the other side of the ocean. For many, that sight was both comforting and cruel. It reminded them of what had been lost, not just in Japan but within themselves. When they reached the harbor, American officers handed each man a small kit, food, clean clothes, and a tag marked "Repatriate." It was a word heavy with irony. They had been soldiers of an empire once destined to rule Asia, now returning as ghosts of its collapse. The sea voyage home was quiet. No one sang. No one spoke of victory or defeat. They stared at the horizon as if afraid it might vanish. And when Japan's shattered coastline finally came into view, tears broke silently among them. Smoke still rose from distant cities. The ports were littered with wreckage, warships rusting in silence, fishing boats reduced to splinters, warehouses burned to the ground. The land of the rising sun had become a graveyard of steel and ashes. On the docks, officials from the new government greeted them with formality but little warmth. The returning soldiers were not heroes. They were reminders of failure, living symbols of a war that had consumed millions. Many civilians turned away as they walked past, unable to meet the eyes of men who had once been gods in uniform. Some of the prisoners' families were gone. Others refused to speak of the years lost. For men like Sergeant Ito, the hardest part was not the shame of defeat, but the silence that followed it. The Empire's grand words, honor, sacrifice, destiny, had vanished into rubble. The men who had clung to those ideals now found themselves strangers in their own land. Yet, even amid the wreckage, seeds of something new began to grow. Tanaka reopened a small school in Nagasaki and began teaching children about peace, an unthinkable word during the war. Nakamura found work as an engineer, building bridges instead of destroying them. He kept a photograph of the American guard who had once shared a cigarette with him, a small reminder that humanity could survive even in captivity. Some never recovered. Yamada, still young but hollow-eyed, disappeared into the countryside, unable to bear the contradictions of survival. He was last seen working the fields in silence, tending to rice paddies under the same sun that had once witnessed his surrender. And yet, in their own quiet ways, every man carried forward the lessons of that strange, merciful captivity. Years later, when Japan rose again, this time through industry, not conquest, many of these former prisoners would look at the factories, the shipyards, the bustling ports, and remember how American hands had once shown them how to build rather than destroy. They had seen the face of defeat and found within it a new kind of strength, the courage to live without hatred. In their memories, the camp remained a paradox, a place of humiliation, yes, but also of awakening. They had gone into the war believing that death was the highest honor. They returned believing that compassion was. As the decades passed and the world moved on, the story of those men faded from public memory. But for those who had lived it, the lessons never did. When the sun set on their final days, they carried with them the quiet understanding that peace is not born in victory. It is forged in the humility of those who survive. And in that realization, amid the ruins of two nations once sworn to destroy each other, the true end of the war was finally written, not in blood or fire, but in the fragile, enduring grace of forgiveness.